Alright, so I figure I got time for one more of these before I leave for work, and it's going to be MER-MAN. So this is another vintage action figure review, and this is actually not a, vintage MER-MAN. This is a commemorative edition MER-MAN, which is basically a replica of the original vintage MER-MAN. The funny thing is like, I think more time has passed since they made the commemorative figures by this point than it had passed by the time that the commemorative figures were made and the making of the original ones. So even though this is a vintage MER-MAN, it's not a vintage MER-MAN. but it's still like it's a toy that came out in like 1999, and that's over 20 years ago. So he might not be vintage, but he's vintage. Anyway, so MER-MAN, you might think I probably should have started with Skeletor, since he was the one this body was made for, but they both came out at the same time, so it's not necessarily like they reused Skeletor's body, even if they kind of technically did, so much as they, share the same body. So you can see, unlike He-Man, who had these sort of furry boots, and his hands were definitely humanoid. I probably should have touched on this when I did the review. I could probably talk about He-Man for hours, but he's got these nice hands that are all veiny. Very realistic looking hands. I was always impressed with those even when I was a kid. And MER-MAN's hands have a similar sort of detail, but I don't think it's quite as sharp as on He-Man. You can see that MER-MAN has claws at his fingertips. They're not very sharp because, it's the molding of 80s action figure technology, and they probably didn't want to be too sharp anyway because, don't want to scratch the kids on him. And he's got these sort of clawed feet, look almost kind of like bird feet, like they're almost feathered. So, probably the main difference you have between the actual vintage MER-MAN and the commemorative MER-MAN is you can see that commemorative MER-MAN has this kind of ridge around the bottom of the feet. Supposedly this was to help the figures stand better. I don't know how much difference it really makes, but that was supposedly the reason. I have a Battle Armor Skeletor handy here, and you can see he does not have that ridge. So that was the main difference between those. MER-MAN has some battle armor, which straps to his back the same way as He-Man. These two buckles over here, and this buckle down at the bottom that looks like a button. It works the same way. And likewise, you can store his weapon back here, which is, of course, the infamous corn sword. Yeah, looks like an ear of corn. So, this is supposed to be like a sawtooth nose, but, I guess the molding of the time wasn't quite up to par to really capture the teeth. So it has this kind of flash around it, which I think you're supposed to pretend like that's not there. You're supposed to ignore that and just pay attention to the teeth. But we didn't know that when we were kids. We just saw it and thought, this sword looks like an ear of corn, so we called it his corn sword. And he can hold it in this hand, but the handle's pretty thick, and it's kind of an awkward fit, and you can see it doesn't go all the way into his hand. So what I usually did, it kind of stretches his hand out a little bit too, even sideways like that. It's pretty thick. It stretches his hand out. So what I usually did instead was I put it into his claw hand, like this, and that was how MER-MAN held his sword. He can be left-handed. We can have left-handed characters on Eternia. Why not? So when I had the first figures that I had on the 8-back package, and it was I think the first one that had an 8-back was Faker, because He-Man and Skeletor I got Christmas morning from Santa Claus, and those were not in the box at all. And Skeletor I got when I went over to my grandmother's house, and she'd put him into my Christmas stocking, so he didn't have a box at all. So I'm pretty sure the first 8-back figure that I had was Faker. And Faker was released, like, he was one of the first figures released in the second wave. And he would have come out, like, around Christmas time. And he was the second action figure of the series that I bought that I picked out myself. The first one being MER-MAN, to my regret. But I remember looking at the 8-back and just looking at all these figures and how awesome they looked. And MER-MAN was one that I thought looked really awesome. And I was, let's be honest, I was a little disappointed when I finally got the figure of MER-MAN because he didn't look much like the figure on the back of the package. For one thing, you can see that he has green hands and green feet. And on the package, he had yellow gloves and yellow shin guards. I think he still had green feet at the bottom, but the shin guards were yellow. And the head sculpt was completely different from how the figure looked on the 8-back. And if you don't know what the figure looked like on the 8-back, I have handy here. This is Classics MER-MAN. And this is the MER-MAN that came in the 2-pack with Aquaman that was sold at Toys R Us. That's why he's blue. He's supposed to be the mini-comics MER-MAN. But the head sculpt on this one looks a lot more like that MER-MAN. And he also has the spikes on the collar, like the 8-back MER-MAN had. So this is a MER-MAN that looks a lot more like the figure that I saw on the back of the package that I was enthralled with. And this figure does not really look like that. He's still a really cool figure, and I was still really happy with him, but I always wanted a MER-MAN that looked more like that 8-back figure. Sorry. But they did the 2000X line, and that MER-MAN, much like this one, was based on the cross-cell artwork. So I was happy to have that one that looked a lot more like the classic MER-MAN, and this one looks even more like that classic MER-MAN on the action figure package. And then the other MER-MAN that I happen to have handy is the Filmation version of MER-MAN, which I absolutely love this one. He's colored much more similarly to his vintage counterpart. Still has the yellow gloves and yellow boots, like the cross-cell artwork had. The obviously very simplified from the original figure because of the animation model. But the head sculpt on that one was great. I liked the way they drew MER-MAN on the Filmation cartoon. So, one thing that I did think was an improvement over the cross-cell artwork is you can see that, like, that MER-MAN had sort of like these googly eyes. They almost look sort of cutesy. His armor kind of got pushed off a little bit. Let's get that back on there. It just kind of tensions onto his neck. It doesn't have any kind of straps on this one. It just kind of fits onto his neck. But he looks kind of cutesy, whereas this MER-MAN, they just gave him like these little pinpricks of pupils, and it gives him like this really intense look. Kind of like what I was talking about with He-Man, where there was sort of an ambiguity to his facial expression. It's like this can look either kind of ferocious or kind of terrified, depending on what angle you look at it from. So this could, like, sneaking up behind Teela or something to menace her, and then he sees He-Man and He-Man! I can't quite do the gargling thing. He-Man! There we go. That's how you do that. So, but yeah, you can see with the Classics one, I think they got more towards what the intention of the Corn Sword was supposed to be, where it's all spiky and threatening. But with the Filmation one, they made that one more sort of a reproduction of the original Corn Sword. And you can see it's not, like, identical. It's still, like, more pointy at the top. And this has kind of got a sharper edge to it, almost like they intended for that to be a blade. But it's got the same sort of bone handle, and it's the same energy. So MER-MAN was one of the first villains, and he was heavily featured on the cartoon, and he was definitely a staple character in the line. Like, he was one that kids would want to have because he was one of the main characters. Not necessarily because they thought the figure was all that great, but because he was heavily featured on the cartoon. They might prefer, Trapjaw or Cobra Khan or somebody like that as far as an action figure goes, but MER-MAN was still a character that you wanted to have just because of that. personally, I love MER-MAN. I thought he was great, and I was really happy to have him. And he always got a lot of use whenever I would play with He-Man figures. But he did kind of get I shoved by the wayside by a lot of kids who he is a little goofy, but that's part of the charm for me. I like MER-MAN. MER-MAN's awesome. So he was later reused for Stinkor, and they put Mech-X armor on him, which kind of helped hide the lower part of his face. But he was colored like a skunk, and I honestly think this head works a little better for Stinkor than it worked for MER-MAN because it's got hair in the back. Like, why does MER-MAN have hair? I have no idea. So despite any sort of changes that they made to him in the production and any corners that were cut, and he didn't turn out exactly the way Mark Taylor had intended when he designed him, but I still think he's a great figure, and he was definitely worth having, and that's why I chose to spotlight MER-MAN as the first villain when I talk about these vintage figures, because he doesn't get enough love, and he deserves a little more love. MER-MAN deserves our love. Alright, well that's pretty much it. I'll try to do another one of these tomorrow, probably, because I've got like a whole bin full of these old He-Man figures that I want to talk about. And then I've got a bunch of classics, and I'll be buying more Origins, hopefully in the near future. So that's pretty much it. We'll talk to you next time. Take care. Bye.